You're listening to Productivity Protected, the podcast that's all about data privacy and security. We'll unpack emerging threats, hot issues in data security, and top ways to protect your data and how you work. Here's your host, Spencer Kupferman.
Ladies and gentlemen, welcome back. Welcome back to the Productivity Protected podcast. I'm your host, Spencer Kupferman. We have a very, very special guest today. Of course, here on the Productivity Protected podcast, we always have special guests. We are talking about understanding sensitive data discovery. We know a little bit about that here at PKWARE, and we've got just the gentleman to tell us all about it. I want to welcome Daniel Howard. Daniel Howard is a senior analyst at Bloor Research. He's going to tell us a little bit about Bloor Research. But before he does that, and I turn it over to him, I want to give you the audience a little background. Daniel Howard comes to us starting his career at the University of Bath in the United Kingdom. After his master's in mathematics at the University of Bath, Daniel worked at a company by the name of IPL. And at IPL, he wore a few different hats, a software tester, a software engineer, experience in software development. Of course, these all formed his ability to then launch his career. If we fast forward to 2016, when Daniel left IPL to work as an analyst at Bloor Research. Daniel's going to tell us a little bit about Bloor Research. They're a research analyst firm, and Daniel actually covers PKWARE. He's going to tell us all about that. But specifically, also, I want to mention this on a personal note. Daniel's inspired by his father, Philip Howard, as his role as a software engineer. And so this is, if you will, kind of a family affair, so to speak. I've also, I can relate to that, was also inspired by my father in the software space. But again, Daniel's expertise in testing, DevOps, development, engineering, technical expertise have given him a really solid, if you want to call it, on the ground perspective of how the cyber world works, specifically as it would relate to the data discovery and sensitive data worlds. Outside of his Bloor Research role, Daniel enjoys Latin, ballroom dancing, that's right, ballroom dancing, board games, skiing, cooking, and playing the guitar. So maybe one day we'll have Daniel come on, maybe he'll play a tune for us. But for now, we're going to talk about understanding sensitive data discovery with Bloor Research's own Daniel Howard. Daniel, welcome to the Productivity Protected podcast.
Hey everyone, this is Daniel. Thank you very much for the introduction, Spencer. I feel quite honoured to be here with such an illustrious start of a podcast. Thank you so much to all the Productivity Protected team for allowing me on here and inviting me on here. I'm really happy to be here, and I'm excited to get going.
Excellent. Thanks for being here. Thanks for your coverage of PKWARE and all the related companies in the data discovery space. Of course, that provides a meaningful benefit to what we do at PKWARE. I'm gonna if we can, Daniel, I'm gonna just jump right on in here in the interest of time, and I guess I want to start with a couple questions. First, as I mentioned in the introduction, love for you to tell our audience about what Bloor Research does, what Bloor Research really majors in. You, for some reason, have gotten into analyzing data discovery specifically, which is, of course, very, very important and meaningful to the cyber world, and of course, data governance as well. I'm going to throw that in there. What was there a seminal moment for you, and if so, I'd love for you to share that with the audience.
Sure. So first of all, let me talk a bit about Bloor Research as a company. We're an analyst firm. We have a shop of analysts, of which I am one, covering a variety of different areas. I specialize in, as you already discussed, data in general, particularly data governance and sensitive data discovery. We also have analysts who specialize in product infrastructure, in sort of more detail, sort of different areas of cybersecurity, in development, all these sorts of stuff. And we provide a variety of sort of consulting and research services to companies in those spaces. As for your more specific question about how I initially came to sensitive data discovery and data governance, I think it was largely for me a matter of timing. Because as you've already mentioned, I started my career as an analyst in 2016. And at that point, this was sort of, and as also we've already touched on, my father was a huge inspiration for me. He was an analyst before me. I spent the first 2 or 3 years of my career working very closely with him. He's retired now, of course, or was retired as an analyst ever since to get, at least. But 2016 was about the time when industry professionals and analysts were first starting to talk about regulations like GDPR. I remember because I was still in software. I was always interested in computers. So I remember him talking to me about it and really impressing upon me, how important this thing was going to be in a couple of years. Even though it was taking some years before it was going to come into practice for virtually everybody. And I think that really lit a fire under me. Sort of, wow, people need to know about this. People need to be more aware of this and stuff like it. And I think there's one other sort of anecdote I can give, which I think will be, which I think had a definite influence on me. When I was still working with IPL, I was actually at one point being subcontracted out to a financial organization here in the UK. And I remember part of my job description there was to do, and with me and with some of the other developers they sort of sent away, was to do a bit of research into, sort of prototype new technologies which have potential for that organization. And I remember, when there was sort of this very sort of semi-agile process of sort of doing some research, making a prototype, presenting it to the rest of the team, that sort of thing. Anyway, one of my co-workers made some sort of presentation on some cyber, governance, security-related topic. I don't remember the fine details. Talking about how this is a great technology, all these financial institutions should be adopting it. It'll make things easier to govern. It'll make things more secure. It'll be great. Anyway, I remember talking to him afterwards, saying, "So, do you think this is going to get adopted? When do you think this is going to come in?" And he kind of said to me, after spending half an hour telling all of us how great it was and how much it would improve things, saying, "Nah, it's not going to happen," because there was just no sense of real will to do it. It was fundamentally a cooperative thing among different banking organizations, and there was no one willing to take the first step. And at the time, this is awful. People need to be doing this stuff. So that definitely, I think, has had an influence on me to this day in terms of, trying to convince businesses to really take this stuff seriously and invest in it.
No, I appreciate that anecdote, and it's also your passion is coming through for this subject, and I'm glad the audience gets to experience that as well. Being coming from that background that you came from, let's keep going. It's a common anecdote, Daniel, in the cyberspace where most companies really don't know where their sensitive data is housed. And that's something we hear a lot from from the conversations we're having with partners and different financial institutions around the globe, and others who are in the space to make sure that they're in compliance. You'd mentioned GDPR, of course. Now there are so many going on, especially here in the United States. Almost seems like every week, every month, another state is coming out with another regulatory compliant law relative to getting their houses in order around cyber hygiene. The fact that companies don't know where all their sensitive data is, or even maybe what sensitive data even is, that's something we've also heard. I just was curious, because again, you're an expert here for our audience. What are good examples of hidden sensitive data that we might not really be thinking about in this industry, or your average organization that's just getting into implementing solutions like this, like a data discovery solution, what would they be maybe missing here?
Okay, so this is a really big topic, so I'll keep my answer sort of short and sweet, I guess, relative to the size of it. Obviously, in terms of different types of sensitive data, there's data which is going to be obviously sensitive. If you're storing an address or a date of birth or a credit card number, that stuff's pretty easy to, not necessarily easy to find, but easy to look at and say, well, that's definitely sensitive. But there's a lot of different sort of data which is perhaps more sensitive only in a certain context or in combined with other kinds of data. So I think there's really two ways sort of this data can get, at a very high level at least, this data can get overlooked. One is from a technical perspective. So if you've got a table and one of the tables is called address, or it's at least full of addresses, but obviously formatted as address data, that's pretty easy to pick up. Not trivial, but not hard. But sometimes you don't have anything that clear cut. You've still got the address data, but it's buried in some sort of text field somewhere. You don't have one field for a name and another for an address, another for date of birth. You've got one field with all of this information slammed into it, sometimes pretty haphazardly. And that can be technically hard to find, even if an actual person looked at it, they would obviously say, well, this looks like an address. But I think the more meaningful point here is about data that is not necessarily sensitive on its own, but becomes sensitive when examined in a certain context. So, for example, geospatial data is a really good example for this, because you could, if you have, for example, times that a customer entered a building, then by itself that's not going to do much. You can't identify an individual from that. But if you replace the building there with, say, a hospital or a particular, a surgery theatre, suddenly you've got a list of all the people who went in for surgery at that place at a particular time, and that starts becoming quite a short list of people it could be. So that can become, very sensitive very quickly when you've got other data that you can combine it with. There's actually a really interesting study for this, which was undertaken by the University of Texas a few years ago, actually probably several years ago. Now I've been using this anecdote for a while, where they took information that Netflix had put out publicly. So this was anonymized data from user reviews of films, all that, which Netflix had anonymized and made available to the public. And researchers took this, compared that review data to review data from other movie websites, which also hosted user reviews. And by cross-checking that data and comparing them, they were able to re-identify who made all of those Netflix reviews of an almost 70% success rate. So you've got this huge issue where there's more than a two-thirds chance that you've been anonymized, but just by looking at your review scores, the information which is most relevant to the company, you can say, well, okay, this is probably this person. So it's really important to consider that sort of combinatoric information. What can happen not just with the information by itself, but when it aggregates with all sorts of other stuff.
No, so that's very relevant, Daniel. The concept of context. I think that can dynamically change the concept of how data is classified there relative to sensitive versus maybe not so sensitive, or as you gave that anecdote, how something very quickly became very sensitive. Appreciate you sharing that. Let's stay with this theme a little bit here if we can. So is sensitive data, let me ask this way, is sensitive data discovery as simple as this is sensitive and this is not? Or is it more of kind of a nuanced process of how much a piece of data really needs to be protected?
I definitely lean to more more towards the more nuanced side of things. I mean, I think like almost everything, I find these days, sensitivity is a continuum. You'll have data which is very obviously very sensitive. Stuff like financial information, passwords, credit card numbers. And you have data which is very obviously not sensitive, stuff which is, maybe stock numbers or something like that. Something which is of very little use to the consumer, but couldn't possibly be used to re-identify someone in any context. But the vast majority of data, I think, is going to fall somewhere between those two extremes. And really, the question is not really how sensitive is this data. It's, as you say, how much does it need to be protected? And ultimately, this is playing a game of risk management. You're asking yourself, okay, given what I know about our system and what I know about this data, how likely is it to be exposed? And if and when it is exposed, how severe is that going to be? I think a good way of thinking about this in some ways is to say, okay, if my information, this kind of information got leaked about me, got leaked about in general, how upset would the general public be that that information had been leaked? Because if you think about credit card numbers or passwords, that stuff gets out there, and there would be, people would be rioting, right, with the right sort of organization. There'd be fires in the streets, so that stuff really needs to be incredibly secure. It cannot be allowed to get out, and you would be, financially, driven into the ground by your local regulating body in most cases if and when that happened. But you start to get into things like lists of names, maybe, customer names, for example. You think, well, okay, that's still not great. We still want to be compliant, but we want to use this information for something, and we can't make it so secure that it becomes impossible for us to use. And at the same time, if a list of customer names got leaked, that's obviously bad, but it's not really as bad as if credit card information got leaked. So I think the overwhelming concern here is, how much do we need to do in order to strike a good compromise between security and usability? Because ultimately, if the data isn't usable, there's no point having it. If you've got data which is so sensitive that you cannot afford to use it under any circumstances, you should just get rid of the data from your system, right? Like, deletion is ultimately the ultimate form of protection, because if you don't have it, you can't possibly expose it. But for everything up to that, you need to figure out, how many people should be getting access to this, how much should we, how stringently should we be protecting this, but how long should we be keeping this for? Because that's, if it is a really sensitive piece of data, you should be keeping it for exactly as long as you need it for, and then binning it, or at least archiving it, because it's a liability to keep it around. Anyway, I think that answers the question. I know I went off on a bit of a tangent there, but obviously, as you said, I'm quite passionate about this topic. So
yeah, I'm thinking of right after we get off this podcast here, Daniel, I'm going to call up all the CISOs for all of our companies and tell them that just delete everything. That's it. You don't need it. You don't need anybody's software. Just forget it. Just delete it. Is it sensitive? Who cares? Just delete it. Doesn't matter. Just delete it, and that's the ultimate form of protection. And you're right. It's the ultimate form of protection, and the exposure doesn't exist if you don't have it. I mean, it's a great point. But again, of course, I'm joking. I hope the customers don't take me seriously on that. But the point is that, and you said it, which is balance. We're going to shift our discussion just a tad, not much, but a tad. And I want to ask this question: are there any let's call it off-label uses for sensitive data discovery, perhaps beyond, or maybe in addition, if you will, to achieving compliance by locating sensitive data for the purposes of protecting that data?
Yes, I definitely think so. And I think these are, I think there are two immediately come to mind. I'm sure there might well be others, But I think the most commonly obvious one is forget about sensitive data discovery, just data discovery. I mean, fundamentally, what you need to do to figure out what if sensitive data is sensitive is to find the data, analyze it, determine its properties, match those against some sort of sensitivity criteria. But up until that last step, you're just doing regular data discovery. You know, if you want to build, I don't know, a data catalog, for example, you could do a lot worse than taking a tool built with sensitive data discovery, but which is perhaps slightly broader than that, using that to classify all of your data, and then just extending this, the sensitive discovery on top of that. And in fact, that's not an uncommon. From looking at the sensitive data discovery space, half of the serious vendors in the space really come in from a data cataloging perspective. So I certainly think that's a fruitful area. There's no reason not to dovetail those capabilities into each other. The other major reason to, I think, use sensitive data discovery is that we've been saying sensitive data discovery for this entire conversation, but what we've really been talking about is the discovery of personal data, PPI, protected data, all that sort of stuff. But sensitive data can actually be seen as broader than that. So, for example, most organizations will be storing data that is not legally protected, but that they would still rather not get out into the wild and for everybody else to see. So, for example, intellectual property, or we were talking about stock numbers before, that might be a good example of that. Or, business plans for the future, roadmaps, all this sort of stuff, which gives them would be a competitive disadvantage if it was made public, because all their competitors would be able to see what they were doing, or they were planning, all of this stuff. But legally, no problem at all. The government doesn't care if you leak all of your private corporate documents to all of your competitors. Your users probably don't care either, frankly. But you still might want to protect that stuff for obvious reasons. And you can use that you can find that and protect it with sensitive data discovery, sensitive data masking, all of these different products just as easily as if it was personal data. You just need a slightly different set of matching criteria. So I think that's a really fruitful area, which is perhaps been often neglected, but which can be a really useful sort of secondary capability for these tools.
Appreciate that. That makes a lot of sense in our world. I want to talk a little bit about, if we can here, a little bit about the concept of breaches as they relate to data discovery and the value that data discovery brings to this whole concept. Breaches are something we read about every single day. Tell us a little bit about, you're really one of the foremost minds in the discovery space here, of course, representing Bloor Research. Tell us a little bit about how discovery helps an organization prepare for this inevitability of a potential attack.
Okay, well, I think there's a fairly obvious sort of methodology here that helps, and there's a perhaps not so obvious one. So I'll cover the former first. The obvious way sensitive data discovery is going to help is that before you have your data, one of these data breaches that lets you figure out what data is sensitive and protect that data, so that when it gets leaked, it's somehow encrypted or de-identified or anonymized. We were talking about, I talked about this example of Netflix several minutes ago, where they made public, this de-identified data, and unfortunately, turns out, it's actually can be used to re-identify people anyway. But if that was a breach, if that had been put out there as de-identified data, even, obviously that re-identification, it potentially is bad, but just the fact that they've done something makes it much less severe. That if it had been a breach, they would have been in a much better place, both from a compliance perspective and I think from a public perception perspective, because there's a severity to it, right? Oh, they could potentially re-identify people by doing this, is much harder to get angry about than they just left all this public data unprotected and then it got out. So even in the situation where the anonymization is not perfect, I think there's an advantage there. But I think realistically, what it helps you do is not make, protect it in a hopefully very effective way. Certainly for things like credit card information, passwords, all this really sensitive stuff can then be found and protected, so that, because that's what these hackers are really trying to get at, right? When that stuff leaks, you want to make sure that it's not really being leaked. The other thing, which I think is more subtle and less obvious, is that when a breach happens, I think, and you can look at all of the breaches which have happened, as you say, seemingly every day, and the companies which get away with it, get away with their reputations intact, are the ones which are able to respond quickly. And I don't just mean in terms of shutting down whatever loophole, whatever security flaw allowed the breach to happen in the first place. I mean, and I don't just mean putting out a message on Twitter saying, "Oh, there's been a breach, we're so sorry." I mean being able to tell people exactly what got out and how concerned their customers need to be. And I think that's a pretty powerful capability that is enabled by sensitive data discovery. Because if you can tell people, okay, we've had a breach, we know some data's got out, but it's only email data, or it's only name data, then you're in a much better position than if you say, well, we don't know. It could be all of your passwords, right? People are going to be much less concerned. They're going to be, even if it turns out not to be the case, you've still scared people. You still created that stir in a way that you perhaps wouldn't if it was something less severe. And I think particularly particularly if you tie your discovery into, if it's proactive discovery, if it's also tied into monitoring, obviously that can also be used to detect breaches as they're occurring. So you hear about it first thing, and not when you open, you wake up for your morning coffee and read the news and think, oh no, my company's had a data breach. You can be on the ball with it if you've got that sort of monitoring capability, which is often tied into discovery, not necessarily, but some of the time.
So your recommendation, if I understand this correctly, is that if there's a breach, Fortune 500 companies shouldn't just send out a tweet and say, "Yeah, hey guys, sorry, there's a tweet. We'll talk to you later." That's not going to fly. We got time for one last question here, Daniel, and I want to really kind of get down to more of the we'll call it the practical application part of, okay, I really feel, I've identified, because what we talk about in the business, as you know, and you rightfully just stated it, is that the first step in cyber hygiene is really understanding where your data is, certainly the sensitive data, because there's so many different tools and solutions out there to apply, but we really can't apply them if we don't know where our data is. And I think that's at the crux of the issue here. We are educating people every day at PKWARE. We're educating our customers and partners and folks in the industry on this very important concept. And I guess from your perspective, what should they really be looking for when they're looking for a data discovery solution in the market?
Well, I mean, you're absolutely right. Because data discovery is so foundational to so many data management areas, all of them basically. It's so common for, every man and his dog has a data discovery capability. The issue is getting something which is actually effective as a data discovery solution instead of just sort of the basic capabilities which allow whatever actual solution the vendor is selling to do its job. And I think, there were sort of a lot of obvious candidates, sort of, which we stretch across all the products we sort of research, which, can be good, things like ease of use, the level of integration provided, breadth of, database support, breadth of, any sort of other coverage. But I really think with sensitive data, the thing to look out for first and foremost, is the depth of the discovery process offered. And what I mean by that is, how do you match data and say that this is sensitive? Because you'll get, these really basic tools which will just look at, say, column names. We'll just say, oh, this column name says address, so that's sensitive, done. This column doesn't say that, so it's not, it's just A or blank or a number we don't know the meaning of. So that's probably not sensitive, so it's fine. Obviously, this isn't going to capture anywhere near everything. And actually databases are infamously tend to have pretty rubbish column names in terms of describing what the content of those columns actually are. Mercifully, most companies which will dare to say they have data discovery capabilities will have more than just column name matching these days. Several years ago, that wasn't the case. And it was a nightmare to sift through them because it's so poor, I wouldn't even count it as a capability at this point. But even looking past that, you have things like looking at the data that is in the columns. You have things like pattern matching. You have code matching, where you look at things like stored procedures and say, okay, what is this doing? How can we find sensitive data using this? There's using machine learning techniques to effectively as an advancement on pattern matching to say, okay, not just here are these coded patterns that we specify, but okay, this isn't this pattern, but it looks like this pattern. Is this a new pattern that is emerging? All this kind of stuff that you can do to make sure that you pick up as much sensitive data as possible while minimizing the number of false positives you're getting on top of that. Because the danger is that, on the one hand, you don't want to not pick up sensitive data, because then it's unprotected, it's not found, it's not protected, and when a data breach happens, you're done, basically. You've not done your job. But at the same time, if you just says, well, everything could be potentially sensitive, you've effectively not done anything at all. So you need some way of picking up just the sensitive data and as little else as possible, minimizing all these false positives. And that's where dedicated tools can really excel, like PKWARE, for example. PKWARE has, I think, probably half a dozen or so discrete matching methods. They can all be combined together, if I'm recalling correctly. So you can create a really nuanced view of what data is sensitive, how sensitive is it, why might it be sensitive, all this kind of stuff during the discovery process, which then allows a real person to come in and, obviously the stuff which is clearly sensitive can be flagged as that, stuff which is clearly not can be flagged as non-sensitive. Everything in the middle provides a really nuanced view provides your users a really nuanced view of, okay, why might this be sensitive? Is this actually sensitive, yes or no? And that allows you to create a really, I think, pretty cohesive view of it. I think that's the sort of capability that you should be looking for if you're serious about discovering all of your sensitive data.
Well, you heard it right here, ladies and gentlemen, on the Productivity Protected podcast from Bloor Research's own Daniel Howard, who says you got to take a look at PKWARE. You got to look at a comprehensive solution for data discovery, and not to mention, of course, some of the other capabilities that we offer. We're certainly not a one-trick pony, but for the interest of this podcast, of course, we're talking about sensitive data discovery, and Daniel Howard spelled it out for us. This is a very important, critical area, discovering data, understanding what your sensitive data is, protecting it properly. When you're in the market, you're looking for solutions. Unfortunately, Daniel, that's all we have time for today. We could continue. I know you could certainly continue to talk about data discovery and sensitive data for another hour, and maybe we'll have you back on here at the Productivity Protected podcast to talk about other very important pressing items that Bloor is researching and that you're analyzing. Really appreciate your insight today. I know our audience really appreciates having guests like yourself, folks that are really in the market looking at not just PKWARE, but multiple solutions out there, being able to give really an independent assessment as to what's the latest and greatest out there, what are the solutions organizations are using to make sure they are in compliance with all the regulatory happenings in the market today, and most importantly, at the end of the day, really protecting their sensitive data. I want to thank you for the time and joining us. Of course, thank you for your coverage at Bloor Research and all the very critical work that you do. That, as I said at the beginning of this podcast, gives our team at PKWARE an inside look at this particular space. There's so many different spaces in the cyber realm, and this is clearly one of our flagship packages in our PK Protect package, our data discovery solution, since that is the first step in cyber hygiene, is knowing and identifying where that data is. It's critical that we have a resource at PKWARE to follow, to read, to educate ourselves. We certainly can't go out and educate the market if we're not educated. And so we'd like to think that Bloor Research plays a very important part in our ecosystem as far as doing that. And you're, of course, the tip of the spear, as I said, and I'm not embellishing. I mean, clearly one of the foremost minds in data discovery in the space today. Appreciate your contribution on the podcast and look forward to having you again.
Well, likewise, Spencer, and thank you very much for having me, and to the entire Productivity Protected team. It's been a real pleasure to be here, and thank you very much for the kind words about my work and about Bloor's work. That's certainly what we're aiming for, and we hope we accomplish it. Other than that, thank you to everybody who's listening to this. Again, really appreciate you coming on and listening to what Spencer and I have had to talk about. It's been a really great time, and just thank you everybody again.
I'm your host, Spencer Kupferman, the CEO of PKWARE, here for the Productivity Protected podcast. We had Daniel Howard from Bloor Research today, who was, as I said, if you're interested in data discovery and learning about what it is, what the value proposition of this concept represents in cyber, Daniel Howard's your guy to read about it. Check out Bloor Research. It's been great with Daniel today. We're looking forward to our next guest and our next episode. Thanks again for tuning in.
Thanks for joining us on today's episode of Productivity Protected. Learn more about how PKWARE protects data and workflows by visiting pkware.com, and join us next time for more insider info on protecting data wherever it lives and moves.